The laughter around the table wasn't friendly, it was sharp, the kind that cuts just enough for everyone to feel it, but no one dares to name it. David heard it, though. He always did. But this time it wasn't about him. It was about the woman sitting quietly by his side, his wife, Amara. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. David had just closed the biggest deal of his career, and his company had decided to host a private dinner for the team. Everyone was there, executives in expensive suits, spouses in polished dresses, and that one colleague who always had too much to drink too early. The chatter was light until Amara walked in. She was stunning, tall, confident, with deep brown skin and eyes that seemed to see through everything. But that didn't stop the whispers. One woman leaned toward another, her lips curling into a smirk. "Did you know she used to be a model?" Another voice replied. "Really? I thought he met her, overseas." Laughter followed. Amara didn't react. She smiled softly, nodded when spoken to, and carried herself like the queen she was raised to be. But David saw it. The way her hand tightened slightly around her wine glass. The way her eyes flickered toward the exit just once. He wanted to leave, but she caught his hand under the table and whispered, "It's fine. Let them talk." Then the moment everyone would remember happened. The CEO stood to make a toast. Glasses lifted, but before he could speak, someone, Richard, David's co-worker, called out, "Hey, David, where'd you meet your wife again? Some charity thing?" The room froze. David's jaw clenched, but before he could answer, Amara looked up, calm, steady. She smiled. "Actually," she said softly, "we met at a conference in Zurich." Her voice was warm, but her eyes, sharp, knowing, silenced the laughter instantly. The CEO hesitated, watching her with a faint look of recognition that no one else seemed to notice. And in that second, the atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly. What no one in that room knew, not yet, was that the woman they were mocking would soon change every single one of their lives. The dinner continued, but the tone had shifted, slightly, yet unmistakably. Conversations that once hummed around the table now carried an edge of curiosity. Everyone wanted to know more about the mysterious woman who had just disarmed the room with a single sentence. But Amara gave them nothing more. She smiled, laughed politely, and let her husband take the lead as the CEO continued his speech. David couldn't stop thinking about the looks. Some were subtle, the raised eyebrows, the forced smiles, while others were openly skeptical. He had seen this before, especially since marrying Amara. To some people, their relationship didn't make sense. A white executive from a powerful tech firm and a black woman whose background no one seemed to know much about. To David, it didn't matter, but to others, it was all that mattered. The story of David and Amara started years before that dinner, long before any of these people even knew her name. Back then, David was just another ambitious software engineer trying to climb the corporate ladder. He worked long nights, skipped weekends, and rarely looked up from his code. One summer, his company sent him to a tech innovation conference in Zurich. He didn't want to go, but that trip would change everything. He remembered walking into the conference hall, hundreds of booths, thousands of people, ideas flying through the air like electricity. And then he saw her. Amara was standing on stage presenting a new AI model that could analyze human speech patterns to detect emotional intent. Her voice was calm, confident, and precise. But what struck him wasn't her beauty, it was her brilliance. She explained complex algorithms like poetry, turning code into something almost human. After her presentation, David approached her. He remembered fumbling over his words, trying not to sound like a fanboy. She laughed, the kind of laugh that melts the edges off formality, and said, "You must be from one of the American firms, always in a hurry, never in the moment." That was their first conversation. Playful, effortless, unforgettable. Over the next few days, they kept running into each other in conference halls, cafes, and even at the airport lounge before their flights. Each time, they talked for hours. They learned about each other, S-worlds, David, S-structured corporate life, and Amara, S, passion for using technology to bridge cultural divides. She wasn't just a researcher, she ran a foundation in Ghana that taught coding to underprivileged youth. "Tech is useless," she said once, "if it doesn't reach the people who need it most." They kept in touch after that conference. Calls turned into visits, visits into something more profound. And soon, David realized this wasn't just admiration, it was love. But love, in their world, wasn't simple. When David first introduced Amara to his circle of colleagues, the reactions were mixed. Some were polite, even supportive. Others masked their discomfort behind awkward compliments. "She's so articulate," one executive said once, as if surprised. David had smiled then, but inside he'd felt something twist. He thought time would change things. It didn't. Still, Amara never flinched. She was used to it. She faced worse, from clients who underestimated her to investors who refused to take meetings once they realized she wasn't a T who they expected. Yet every time someone tried to diminish her, she grew stronger. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was armor forged through years of being underestimated. At home, she was different. Playful, warm, always teasing David about his inability to cook anything that didn't come in a box. They had their small rituals: morning coffee on the balcony, late-night coding sessions, spontaneous road trips when work became too heavy. David often told her, "You make everything feel lighter," and she'd reply, "That's because I know how heavy things can get." Now, sitting at that dinner table, David's mind drifted back to all of that, to every moment that led them here. The whispers around him faded into background noise. He looked at Amara and realized she wasn't just enduring this. She was observing, watching, calculating. It wasn't anger he saw in her eyes. It was patience, like she knew something no one else did. The CEO finally finished his toast, and as the clinking of glasses filled the air again, Richard leaned closer to another colleague. "Conference in Zurich, huh?" he muttered. "Sure, probably something fancy sounding." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but Amara caught it. This time she didn't look away. She smiled, the same calm, unreadable smile, and said, "You know, Richard, I think you'll find Zurich quite interesting, especially if you're into global tech acquisitions." Richard froze. The others exchanged puzzled glances, unsure what she meant. David knew that tone. Amara was setting the stage. And though no one else realized it yet, the real story, the one they'd all remember, was beginning. The dinner was meant to be a celebration, but as the evening went on, it felt more like a test. Subtle remarks filled the air, hidden beneath layers of polite laughter. Every time Amara spoke, people listened, not because they cared, but because they were trying to find cracks. She could sense it. She'd spent her life reading rooms like this. She knew how to turn a silent judgment into a stage. Richard, however, wasn't content with whispers. He had that type of arrogance that came from years of getting away with condescension. He leaned back in his chair, his voice just loud enough for others to hear. "So, Amara," he said with a smirk, "what do you do now that you're not modeling or whatever it was in Zurich?" David tensed, his hand tightening around his fork. But Amara didn't flinch. She smiled, her tone soft but deliberate. "Oh, I still work in tech," she said, "mostly with data systems and global innovation projects." Richard chuckled. "Innovation projects? Sounds vague. Do you work with startups or just like charities?" Amara's lips curved slightly. "Sometimes both, sometimes neither. Depends on the acquisition." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because they were unsure what else to do. The word acquisition hung in the air like a foreign language. Even the CEO, seated 2 chairs down, glanced at her. Interest piqued. To change the subject, one of the wives, Melissa, jumped in. "That's so nice. You must love traveling. My husband and I went to Europe once. Rome, Paris. Beautiful places." She smiled tightly, her tone coated with patronizing sweetness. "But Zurich, that's an unusual choice for a vacation." Amara took a sip of wine before replying. "It was business. I was keynoting at a conference." The silence was immediate. Melissa blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, that's lovely." David couldn't help but feel proud, even as the tension in the room deepened. Amara wasn't just holding her own. She was dismantling them one by one, without ever raising her voice. The dinner plates were cleared, replaced with dessert. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned in again, feigning curiosity. "So, if you're in tech, maybe you've heard of a company called Syntech Global? We've been negotiating a merger for months. Big deal, actually." Amara looked at him with that same unreadable calm. "Yes," she said. "I know Syntech very well." Richard smirked. "Oh, really? How so?" Amara's gaze didn't waver. "Let's just say I've been involved in a few conversations about it." The CEO's glass paused midway to his lips. "Conversations?" he asked slowly. Amara turned to him, her tone perfectly measured. "Yes, with your board, actually." The entire table went still. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" David looked at her, caught between admiration and disbelief. He knew she had connections, powerful ones, but this was different. She wasn't just making a statement. She was making history. Amara smiled again, this time with a trace of warmth. "I probably shouldn't say too much. NDAs, you know how it is." The CEO's lips parted, then closed again. He studied her for a moment, realization slowly dawning. "You're Amara Mensah?" The sound of her full name silenced the room. A faint tremor of recognition spread across the table. Even those who had mocked her earlier now sat frozen. Richard's smirk faded completely. David finally spoke. "Wait, you didn't tell me you—" She reached over, touching his hand gently. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Tonight is about you." But the others couldn't stop whispering. Amara Mensah, the founder of Neural Bridge Systems, a company that had quietly revolutionized global data encryption and was rumored to have government-level contracts. The same Amara who had walked away from the public eye years ago after selling her company for over $500 million. Richard's face turned pale. He tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on. That can't be you. You're saying you're that Amara?" She tilted her head slightly. "You say that like it's a compliment." The CEO laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Richard, I'd suggest being careful with your assumptions. Neural Bridge was one of our biggest acquisitions last year." He turned to Amara. "I didn't realize you were that investor. The board speaks very highly of your contributions." "Thank you," Amara replied softly. "It's been fulfilling work." David watched as the power in the room shifted entirely. Moments ago, she'd been an outsider, the subject of whispers. Now, she was the most powerful person in the room. The people who had laughed at her were now tripping over themselves to ask questions. Melissa leaned forward, eyes wide. "I had no idea. You must travel so much. That must be exhausting." Amara smiled. "Not really. I prefer to spend my time where it matters." Her words were kind, but they carried weight. Every sentence was a mirror, showing each of them exactly who they'd been just moments before. Richard tried again, desperate to recover. "Well, you certainly had us fooled." He chuckled awkwardly. "Guess we should have done our homework." Amara looked directly at him. "No, Richard. You should have had respect. Homework wouldn't have fixed that." The table went dead silent. Even the music in the background seemed to fade. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, Richard lowered his gaze. The smirk that had lived on his face all evening finally cracked. "You're right," he muttered quietly, though no one asked him to. "I was out of line." Amara didn't gloat. She nodded. "Growth starts with acknowledgement," she said. "So, I'd say you're already ahead." The CEO cleared his throat and stood. "Well, I think we've all learned something tonight." He lifted his glass. "To Amara, for reminding us that brilliance doesn't always come in the package we expect." The others echoed the toast, their smiles tight, eyes full of guilt and admiration. Richard didn't say a word. He just sat there, shrinking into his chair. As the clinking of glasses filled the air again, David leaned toward his wife. "You planned this, didn't you?" he whispered. Amara's eyes sparkled. "I didn't plan anything," she said softly. "I just stopped hiding." And with that, she took a sip of her wine, poised, unbothered, victorious. Around her, the room buzzed with hushed conversations, each person trying to reconcile what they'd just learned. The same people who had mocked her now couldn't stop saying her name. For the first time that night, David leaned back in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders. He looked at his wife and smiled. He didn't need to defend her anymore. She had already done that herself, flawlessly. The room buzzed with a kind of silence that was louder than noise, the sound of realization settling over every person present. The murmurs that once carried gossip now carried regret. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly unsure of where to look. Moments ago, they had seen Amara as David's wife. Now they saw her for who she truly was, a force that had quietly shaped the very industry they worked in. The CEO leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I can't believe I didn't connect the dots sooner," he said finally. "You were the one behind Neural Bridge's adaptive encryption. We modeled half our current system on that framework." Amara smiled modestly. "Well, innovation isn't about ownership," she replied. "It's about impact. If something I built helped improve your systems, then I'd call that a win." Her humility only deepened the contrast. Around her, the people who had mocked her just an hour ago now hung on every word. Their laughter had turned to reverence, their condescension to awe. Even the waitstaff, sensing the shift, began to move more carefully, as if aware they were witnessing something significant. Richard sat silently, his earlier smugness gone. He stared at the table, avoiding eye contact. Every word Amara spoke seemed to echo louder in his mind. For years, he'd believed success came with pedigree. Ivy League degrees, corporate titles, the right social circles. Yet here was a woman who'd earned her power through brilliance and purpose. The CEO finally broke the silence again. "You know, Amara," he said, "I think I owe you more than an introduction. You've been consulting for us behind the scenes through the merger, haven't you?" Amara nodded gently. "Yes. I was brought on as a strategic advisor to align the new technology with ethical data use policies. It's part of what I've been advocating for, responsible AI development." A murmur of understanding rippled through the group. Ethical AI. It was the buzzword everyone threw around, but few truly practiced. The irony wasn't lost on them that the woman they'd just dismissed embodied the very integrity their company prided itself on. David sat quietly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. He'd always admired his wife's mind, but this was something else. He was seeing her not just as his partner, but as a leader, a visionary. Richard finally spoke up, his voice softer now. "I read about Neural Bridge," he said, not looking at her directly. "They said it was founded to prevent data from being weaponized, that it saved thousands of people from digital fraud in developing countries." Amara nodded. "That was one of our goals, yes. We wanted to make data security accessible, not just profitable. Most of the breaches in developing regions happen because people don't have the infrastructure to protect themselves. I didn't build Neural Bridge to get rich. I built it so people could sleep at night knowing their information was safe. Her words hung in the air like a sermon. For a moment, no one moved. Then the CEO leaned forward, almost smiling. And here I was thinking you were just David's plus one. Laughter broke out. Nervous, genuine, and humbling all at once. Even Amara laughed, the sound breaking the tension that had held the room hostage. Richard took a deep breath, finally meeting her gaze. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not just for what I said tonight, but for how I thought. I assumed you didn't belong here. Turns out none of us belong on your level. Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then slowly she smiled. Apology accepted. And I don't believe in levels, Richard. I believe in awareness. We can't change what we don't see, and you saw it tonight. David placed his hand over hers under the table. She glanced at him, eyes softening. You're incredible, he whispered. She squeezed his hand. You always knew that? She whispered back. The CEO stood, raising his glass once more. To awareness, he said. And to the woman who reminded us what it really looks like. Everyone followed suit, glasses clinking. The sound was softer this time, more sincere, more grounded. But beneath the surface, the revelation had done more than just humble a few executives. It had sparked something deeper. Reflection. People who'd once dismissed Amara because of her skin, her gender, her silence, now found themselves re-examining the biases they'd never acknowledged. As the dinner drew to a close, the guests began to leave in clusters, murmuring polite goodbyes. Richard approached David, awkwardly adjusting his tie. Listen, man, I didn't mean... David cut him off gently. You did, but you learned. That's what matters. Richard nodded, grateful for the grace. You've got a hell of a woman, he said, before walking away quietly. When only a few people remained, the CEO approached Amara and David. Amara, he said, I'd like to invite you to speak at our global summit next quarter. We could all use more of your insight and your courage. Amara smiled, her tone calm but resolute. I'd be honored, but only if we can talk about more than innovation. Let's talk about empathy. Let us talk about what happens when leadership forgets the people it's meant to serve. The CEO paused, then nodded slowly. Deal. As the last guests trickled out, David and Amara stepped outside into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered against the glass towers, their reflections dancing in the quiet. David exhaled, finally letting go of the tension that had gripped him all evening. You know, he said, I think you just made history in there. Amara laughed softly. No, David. I just told the truth. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something profound. She had never tried to prove anything to anyone. She'd been living her truth the entire time. The world was catching up. They stood there for a while, hand in hand, the city alive around them. The air felt lighter now, the weight of ignorance lifted from their shoulders. Back inside, Richard lingered by the door, watching them through the glass. For the first time, he didn't feel envy. He felt respect, maybe even admiration. He turned to the CEO, who was still finishing his drink. You think we'll ever be like that? He asked quietly. The CEO smiled faintly. If we start listening instead of assuming, he said. Maybe. Outside, Amara looked up at the stars. Funny, she said softly. The same people who laughed at me now want to hear my story. David smiled. That's how it always starts. They mock what they done and understand until they realize it's what they need to learn from. Amara nodded, eyes reflecting the city lights. Then maybe it's time we stop trying to fit in, she said, and start standing out, even if it makes people uncomfortable. He slipped his arm around her. "You've been standing out your whole life. The rest of us are just learning how to follow." They walked away together, leaving behind the whispers, the judgment, and the old version of that room. Behind them, the sound of laughter echoed faintly. But this time, it wasn't cruel. It was changed. It was aware. And for the first time, the world around them finally saw Amara, not as a curiosity, not as a headline, but as what she had always been, a woman who commanded respect without ever asking for it. The night after the dinner, David and Amara sat together in their living room, the city lights flickering through the window. The event was over, but the echoes of it lingered, the whispers, the looks, the stunned silence. David turned to her. "You handled that like... I don't even know how to describe it. Grace, power, calm, all at once." Amara smiled faintly. "I've had practice," she said. "The world teaches you early how to stay composed when people underestimate you." He nodded, his voice softer. "But tonight felt different. It wasn't just about proving something. It was like you held up a mirror to everyone in that room." Amara looked down at her hands, turning her wedding ring slowly. "That's the thing about mirrors," she said. "Most people avoid them because they're afraid of what they'll see." David watched her, realizing how much strength lived beneath her quiet demeanor. It wasn't pride. It was endurance. The kind of strength built from years of having to be twice as good to earn half as much recognition. He moved closer, wrapping his arm around her. "You changed how they see you tonight," he said. Amara shook her head gently. "No, David. I changed how they see themselves. That's what real change looks like." The room fell quiet again, filled only by the hum of the city outside. Across town, Richard sat in his apartment, his tie loosened, a glass of untouched scotch in front of him. The events of the evening replayed in his mind. Every joke, every look, every word that had seemed harmless at the time. Now they echoed differently. He opened his laptop and typed Amara Mensah into the search bar. Articles flooded the screen. Interviews, awards, features in global tech journals. There were photos of her speaking at conferences, mentoring young women in Ghana, and advocating for digital equality. He scrolled through one quote that stopped him cold. "You can't dismantle a system by becoming what it rewards. You change it by being what it fears: truth, compassion, and excellence." Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. He realized he'd spent his entire career chasing approval from people like himself, blind to how much brilliance he'd ignored in others. That night, something cracked open inside him. Not guilt, growth. Back at home, David poured 2 glasses of wine. "Do you ever get tired of having to prove people wrong?" he asked. Amara laughed softly. "Every day. But I don't do it for them. I do it for the ones watching. The quiet ones who don't have the voice yet." She took a sip, her gaze distant. "When I was a kid," she continued, "my mother used to say, 'Let them talk. The day will come when their words echo back to them, and they'll realize who they were talking about.'" David smiled. "She'd be proud of you." Amara looked at him, her expression softening. "I hope so. But I think she'd tell me to keep going, because for every room like that one, there are 1,000 more waiting to change." Days later, a ripple effect began. Photos from the dinner surfaced on the company's social page. The CEO, David, and Amara standing together. The caption read, "Diversity isn't just about presence, it's about perspective. Tonight we were reminded of both." The post went viral. People began searching her name, sharing her story, quoting her lines. The whispers that had once mocked her had turned into a chorus of respect. David's co-workers started approaching him differently, not with pity or awkward curiosity, but with genuine admiration. Even Richard reached out, not to apologize again, but to ask if Amara would consider mentoring their new diversity initiative. When David told her, she smiled. See? Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in embarrassment. Weeks later, Amara stood backstage at a global tech summit preparing for her keynote. The same CEO from the dinner introduced her with a tone of genuine pride. "Tonight," he said, "we welcome a visionary who reminds us that innovation is nothing without inclusion." As Amara walked on stage, the applause was thunderous. She looked out at the sea of faces, men and women, executives and students, all waiting to hear her speak. For a brief moment, she thought of that dinner table, the whispers, the laughter, the judgment, and how easily ignorance can masquerade as confidence. She began, her voice calm yet commanding. "People often ask how I stay composed when faced with prejudice," she said. "The truth is, I stopped fighting for acceptance. I started standing in authenticity. You see, the moment you stop needing validation from those who misunderstand you, you become unstoppable." The crowd was silent, captivated. "I was once told that perception is power," she continued. "But I learned something else. Power isn't about perception, it's about purpose. And purpose doesn't whisper, it speaks, even when people try not to listen." The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, but Amara's eyes found David in the front row. He was smiling, not with pride, but with understanding. She smiled back, then closed her speech with the same quiet fire that had always defined her. "Don't let anyone's ignorance become your identity," she said. "Be kind, be bold, be the reminder that grace is stronger than judgment, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply being undeniable." The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. That night, as they walked back to their car, David turned to her. "You know," he said, "you're changing people, one story at a time." Amara smiled. "That's the goal. Change doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in hearts." They stopped at the edge of the parking lot, the city lights glowing behind them. For a moment, they said nothing, just breathed in the night, the sound of distant applause still echoing faintly. Finally, Amara whispered, "They mocked what they couldn't see. But once they opened their eyes, they couldn't look away." David squeezed her hand. "And they never will again." They walked on, hand in hand, disappearing into the glow of the city. Two people who had turned a dinner party into a lesson the world would never forget. Don it judge by what you see, because behind every quiet strength lies a story you don to know, a brilliance you haven't yet understood, and a power you never imagined. And sometimes, the person you underestimate is the one who will teach you the greatest lesson of your life. Suppose this story moved you. Hit that subscribe button. Not just for more stories like this, but because every view helps spread the message that respect isn't optional. In that case, it's earned in how we treat each other. Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Because someone out there still needs to hear this story. And maybe tonight, it'll change them too.